Welcome to the Institute of South Asian Studies podcast series, where we bring you top notch analysis on contemporary political, economic, and foreign policy issues in South Asia. 60 years ago, in October 1962, India and China fought their only war. 60 years hence, the border dispute remains unresolved, with India China confronting multiple crises in the last decade. The rivalry is not only underlined by US China contestation, but also increasing competition between India and China. To talk about the implications of the 1962 India China War and its shadow on the contemporary developments in India China relationship, we have a very special guest, Dr. Jabin Jacob. Dr. Jacob is one of the foremost sinologists in India. He is an associate professor at Shiv Nadar University in New Delhi and an adjunct fellow at National Maritime Foundation. He was formerly assistant director of the Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi. He is author of multiple books, scholarly articles, and policy briefs on all things China. Dr. Jacob, welcome to South Asia Chat.
Thank you, Yogesh. Pleasure to be here.
So, starting on the conversation, what are the political, military, and strategic consequences of the 1962 war? 60 years later, what imprint do you see of the war on India China relations?
Well, to start with the political, I think it's the defeat of India in the war led to a very close system of government approach to foreign policy and especially to strategic affairs, security issues. The government became the sole arbiter voice, the dominant voice on issues of foreign policy, with very little input allowed from civil society, from the academic community on matters of foreign policy and security issues. And I think that is really one of the longest lasting impacts. We still see the effect of this in our foreign policy analysis and foreign policy in general today. Militarily, of course, for the Indian Army, this was a big setback. I mean, this was a very successful army. If you consider the fact that the Indian Army fought all over the globe in the Second World War, but when it came to its first real important action post independence, it turned up. It failed. So. And since then, I think the Indian Army has certainly not been able to live down this reputation of defeat with the Chinese. It has affected thinking on China to a large extent. And of course, strategically, we have the boundary dispute alive and kicking in India's relationship with China, constraining India's other foreign policy options as well. So, in 60 years, I think 60 years later, these constraints are still, these effects are still visible on Indian foreign policy, Indian security policy. Clearly with Galwan in 2020, it shows that we haven't really progressed much in terms of resolving the boundary dispute and in terms of the structural impediments to better India-China relations or to India's rise itself and influence in both in the region as well as globally.
All right, thanks. So we kind of discussed a bit on how the war had implications on India. But what about China? Because much of the literature, there's a lot of literature on the Indian side. There's a constant, narrative, not only in terms of research but also policy. A lot more people speak about how India sees the war. But how does the war figure in the Chinese political and strategic narrative? Do you observe any consequences of the war and how Beijing pursues its relations with India?
Well, overall, I would argue that this particular conflict was something of a very short, a very small blip as far as China's international relations of the period were concerned. China had far more consequential and serious issues that it was dealing with, or it has subsequently dealt with, in terms of the relationship with the USSR and with the United States. Those were the conflicts, those were the theaters that the Chinese took or saw as much more important for their foreign policy and security interests. I think in '62, what the Chinese, the Chinese narrative was that we had delivered or we would teach the Indians a lesson, and in terms of how India responded, India laid low. India tried to ignore the problem with China. I think in that sense, the Chinese were certainly effective in sort of pacifying the relationship with India. This was not a relationship that would trouble the Chinese for a very long time. But it's not entirely the case that the Chinese haven't examined this relationship. In recent years, especially as India's economic and international profile has increased, the Chinese have returned to focusing or paying attention to India. Uh, and it's the relationship with India has not only, at least in the security domain, has not only been limited to the boundary issue. The Chinese were involved in fomenting and supporting insurgencies in India's northeast until at least until the late 70s, when the Chinese started focusing on their economic development and so on. I think today, with China beginning to see itself as a putative successor to the United States at the top of the global hierarchy, the Chinese have started paying attention to India, but less so for India's, for India's own sake, but because they see India or they perceive India as some sort of an ally or a partner to the Americans, and therefore they see India as part of the larger strategic competition that they have with the United States. And clearly, as I think they see the boundary dispute, the fact that the boundary dispute remains active as some sort of a pressure point on the Indians. But let's also not forget that the boundary dispute is essentially also about Tibet. That the Chinese are extremely concerned about the fact that the Indians talk of or continue to exercise some degree of cultural and historical sort of influence on Tibet, and that they believe that as long as the Indians do not acknowledge that Tibet was historically a part of China, then China's own hold and control over Tibet remains in question, and this is also something that the Chinese are very, very concerned about.
So one thing, which I have noticed in the Chinese discourse, and if I remember back looking at the documents in the Indian archives, there was this first visit by Indian Foreign Minister in February 1979, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, going to China, and that was the time of the when China had initiated, its Vietnam incursions. And there was a statement about putting Vietnam into place just as they did India in 1962. So the template of 1962, to put regional adversaries into place is a major narrative, in China, and we are looking at that again in the weeks leading up to the war anniversary. Within China, there has been a renewed attention to the 1962 war, again as a template in a sense of how China would deal, with regional adversaries, which might not confirm. The People's Liberation Army has showcased the war in an exhibition at Beijing's military museum, where it has blamed India for the conflict. So this whole idea of using 1962 war as an example of what China can do, where does that figure in the larger Chinese narrative, and the celebration of the war as we saw recently? Where does the 1962 war fits into that larger strategic narrative within China?
Okay, so there are at least two things that are happening here. One, of course, as you pointed out, there is this narrative of conveying to smaller powers that they ought to know their place, and that since China is a top dog, they should behave accordingly. Now, this is something that the Chinese have constantly, whether diplomatically or not so diplomatically, tried to communicate to other powers in or other countries in Asia. That's one part of it. But there's also modern, current, contemporary context, which is that in Xi Jinping's China, the focus really is on China preparing itself, getting ready to take over as global number one from the United States. And for this, Xi Jinping at least certainly believes that it's not enough that we just simply, or the Chinese simply talk about economic dominance or foreign policy influence. This has to be backed by military might as well. And remember, the PLA is the party's army. The PLA does not belong to the PRC, the state, the Chinese state, but it belongs to the party. And it's very important, therefore, to keep the PLA in, shall we say, top shape, not just to fight against China's supposed enemies, but also to ensure that the party remains, to protect the party's interests and the party remains in power in China. And so, from this point of view, it's very important to create a narrative for the Communist Party. This is a single, this is a party state. There's a party that dominates all in China. To create this us versus them narrative, to create a very polarized discourse in which the ordinary Chinese, as well as the party itself, sees the rest of the world in conflict with the party, with China, and therefore to showcase or highlight China's conflicts, China's supposed victories in conflicts with other countries is very important. And remember also that China has very little in terms of actual combat experiences since 1949. 62, 69 with the Soviets, and before that, of course, the Korean War and the Vietnam conflict. But in the last 30 odd years, there's been very little. And for Xi Jinping, and one of the things he's always talked about since coming to power is to talk about the need to actually be engaged in real combat, to understand real combat. And so all of these exhibitions, the narratives in the press, talking about struggle in party documents, party conferences or meetings, etc., is of this piece of trying to say that, well, China, the path to global number one is not going to be easy, that China might have to engage in conflict, and and the Chinese and the PLA need to be prepared for this. So that's the objective, that's the motivation behind all of this.
Sure, that's a very interesting perspective because when we're looking at China, and often we look at China as a monolith, we kind of don't really appreciate the internal dynamics as well as the dynamics of the PLA. So this whole idea about the narrative around Xi Jinping and using these events to kind of bolster his position, but also to kind of portray PLA as a 800-pound gorilla in a sense, to keep that morale is a very, very interesting argument. So coming to more contemporary, the contemporary shadow of the war, but also kind of focusing on how it informs kind of the India-China relationship today, particularly on the border. And there have been comparisons between, number of events which led up to 1962 war, which included a number of border confrontations between India and China, maybe from 1958 onwards, actually. Starting at the Longju incident in 1958, if I'm correct, and correct me if I'm wrong. But Galwan, Doklam, Galwan are kind of that precursor. So there is some kind of comparison between 1962 war and events which happened before, and the Doklam and the Galwan crisis. What kind of similarities do you see between those two periods, in a sense, or the other differences? And also that, what has been the response of the international community leading up to the 1962 war, but also compared to the contemporary crisis, multiple crises which have happened between India and China, and possibly if there is a bigger military confrontation tomorrow. Can we learn something out of the 1962 war?
So, you're quite right in saying, in pointing to the fact that, the Longzhou incident of, 59 was the beginning of, several series of incidents which led to 62. And I think even in the case of Galwan, one could argue that the indications were very much in place since at least 2013. There was the first major incursion or a qualitatively different kind of Chinese transgression in Depsang in 2013, followed by Chumar in 2014. And then you saw the Chinese incursion into Bhutanese territory in Doklam in 2017. And so, at least I have been arguing that all of these incidents were qualitatively different. And the Chinese were trying something new at each kind of transgression. And so, conflict was inevitable. Maybe in 62, we did not perceive it as such, but certainly in 2020, 2022, we certainly did not have any excuse to assume that something violent wasn't coming, wasn't around the corner. Even in 2017, in fact, in the middle of the Doklam incident, we had a very violent clash at Pangong So in August of 2017. So the troops have been coming into contact much more frequently. The contact was often physical. It was, I mean, it led to injuries on both sides. So, I mean, in many ways, 2020, Galwan was waiting to happen. So in that sense, yes, there are some similarities, but also I think the fact that 2020 Galwan did not escalate into a full-blown conflict, I think also speaks to the different structural realities that we have around us. The international situation certainly, but the capacities of the two armies is one. The fact that both are nuclear armed powers, the fact that the international community now pays greater attention to what both India and China are doing, and therefore all of this also matters in terms of how conflict develops or how conflict is prosecuted. Um, so um, so there are also differences. I mean, I would not rule out the fact that there aren't. I mean, there might be possibilities of more conflicts going forward. In fact, I've said that this situation of conflict is really the new normal. I mean, not the new normal or the reset that the informal summits between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping of China were supposed to have created. But this incident in Galwan, the fact that now we have a completely militarized line of actual control, that we might have casualties in conflict or even small scale conflicts or local incidents along the LAC. I mean, this is really going to be the new normal. Now, in terms of international responses, I think, of course, in 1962, what India discovered was that the non-alignment would only take it so far. Many of the countries that were part of the non-aligned movement, Indonesia and so on, were actually neutral or even took the side of the Chinese. And one thing, of course, that is continued is both in 62 as well as currently, the Americans have come to India's assistance. The Soviets have also, or the Soviets slash Russians have also taken a more neutral position. I think the reality is that India is now an important player, an important power, and more or less now we have learnt that we need to be able to stand on our own and deal with the Chinese, on our own. I mean, there's only so much that the international community can come in to do. I mean, there's no question of mediation. China is too big, India is too big to allow third party mediation. Uh, and how they sort of prosecute the conflict or any potential conflict really depends very little, I think, on the international community as much as domestic dynamics within each of these countries and how they perceive each other as behaving.
Right. And also, in a sense that what kind of military stalemate can India actually, pose on the border and create those costs, at least perceptually, for China. So that is great. Moving on, in a sense that when we look at these crises, we always think about them as a watershed moment. So both in academia as well as in policy making, 1962 is seen as somewhat of a inflection point in India's foreign policy, and people have argued that it has become much more realist after that. Many people argue it became much more realist after 1991, and a lot have argued today that India approach to China has become much more realist after Galwan, so to say. How do you see the overall impact of these crises, in a sense, on Indian foreign policy generally? What does India learn, not only from the 1962 war, but also maybe from the Galwan crisis? And are these temporary shifts? Is there, a running spine of Indian foreign policy and strategy which doesn't really change, but also only caters to the contextual demands of the time, depending upon these crises? Or are these really inflection points in Indian foreign policy?
So Yogesh, those are all very important questions. I think when you say watershed, one of the implications is that we see this very clearly, and frankly, I think it takes some time for us to understand or assess properly whether something is an inflection point or a watershed. And often it's perhaps not one moment, but perhaps a series of moments, perhaps closer in time. Of course, that creates a watershed. And one of the reasons why I'm a little chary of calling it, I mean, sort of being definitive, is because, to my mind, certainly Galwan is an inflection point. But the thing is, how long lasting an inflection point is really the question, isn't it? Whether we can actually call it a fully a watershed is really the question. Because if you remember, and I just pointed this out, at the end of the informal summits, after Doklam, we had the informal summits between the leaders of the two countries, and the Indian Ministry of External Affairs classified it as, called it a moment of reset in India-China relations. And now clearly it was nothing of the sort, because 6 months after the last or the second informal summit, we had Galwan. Now the Indian government is saying, well, we cannot return to normal until the situation on the LAC is resolved. So you could very well say that this sort of decision or this attitude also constitutes an inflection point or a reset. Because logic since 1988, when Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visited China, was that we could leave the boundary dispute aside to take its own course towards resolution while developing other parts of the relationship. But today, after Galwan, we are back to square one in a sense. We are saying that we cannot leave the boundary dispute be while pursuing normalcy in other parts of the relationship, which is why, post Galwan, one of the first steps that the Indian government took was to target China economically. Target Chinese apps, put restrictions on Chinese FDI, target Chinese companies operating in India, and so on. Now, the problem is there's obviously going to be pushback from the Chinese. The Chinese are already saying, look, after all these several rounds of military to military talks and gradual, painfully slow disengagement from multiple points of friction in eastern Ladakh, the Chinese are beginning to say that, look, the situation is returning to normal. We are returning to normal border management. And therefore, we need to now start talking about or focusing on other parts of the relationship. Now, the Indian government is resisting clearly because we haven't really gotten back to a status quo ante, before Galwan. So this means that, and now, of course, the flip side, rather, the other part of it is that there is pressure from within India, perhaps from within economic actors, saying, well, we need to get back to an economic relationship with the Chinese because this is obviously worth thousands of crores of rupees, right? This trade between India and China. So now, if the government then decides, well, okay, we have achieved a fair degree of return to normalcy on the LAC and we shall now return to business as usual, again, we can no longer say then this is an inflection point, because then again, we are going back to a situation where we are leaving aside the boundary dispute and focusing on other parts of the relationship. And remember, of course, that India has continued to engage with the Chinese in such forums as, for example, the BRICS. And even as it pursues relationships with the Americans, the Japanese, and the Australians through the Quad or through the Malabar exercises. To my mind, the Indian government strategy or China policy is not very clear. It's taking a hard line on the LAC, but we do not have enough information on exactly what is going on at the LAC. To my mind, I see that the Chinese are setting the pace on the LAC, both in terms of creating the conflict as well as in terms of how the negotiations proceed. So we still have to wait and watch. My sense is that this is not likely to end anytime soon, that India-China relations are irrevocably on the downward slide for the foreseeable future.
Thank you so much. In a sense that, if I can paraphrase it, there can be no inflection points because much of it depends upon what you want, but also what the adversary wants. So the adversary continues on the side of bellicosity, you will have to respond like that. But also, there can be an accommodation tomorrow depending upon how it plays out with China. But as you rightly said, at this point in time, it doesn't appear to be so. But that's much more about, that there can be no watersheds, especially in strategy and foreign policy. And thanks for that. But lastly, in a sense that, just taking the seg from your last comment, we know that we are in that territory where India-China relations are worst in decades. Maybe since last time maybe 1960s. In my understanding of India-China relations, I would characterize it something of the 60s vintage, which we are looking at this point in time. But going forward, what are the challenges? You mentioned some of the challenges which India, which confront India, but also China might have some challenges about India as well if this adversarial relationship continues. So, what are India's challenges? What are China's challenges? But also, what are possible ways in which this relationship can get back to normal? And I know that the normal is too far at this point in time, but if we just have to put our thinking hats on, and since we have you here who knows so much about India and China, what could be the possible alternatives in a sense?
So, like I said, I mean, my personal assessment is that India-China relations are unlikely to improve anytime soon. But there's a sort of an international context here where both India and China need to engage with each other, if nothing else, to show that they have some bargaining chips in hand when they deal with third countries. Now, in the case of India, that is the United States, and in the case of the Chinese, they need to show that they are not only engaged in conflict with the West, but they also have other countries on their side in this conflict with the West. I mean, they'd rather have multiple countries supporting them. And there are areas where India and China have similar concerns with respect to the West in terms of the nature of international institutions, the nature of the international order, and the space they give to countries, developing countries, questions of climate change, responsibility for climate change, climate finance, issues such as these, right? Questions of energy security, questions of handling and managing regional conflicts, and so on, where India and China will willy-nilly have to sort of have some kind of conversation. Take, for example, on Afghanistan, or say if Pakistan, remains an unstable polity, or Myanmar, India and China will have to sort of run into each other. So there are those issues certainly, but the danger is frankly this black and white approach that comes from inside of China, where the Chinese have decided that the time for conflict or the time to challenge the United States is here, and from the perspective of a one-party state or a party state or a dominant party, a one-party state, as China is, to portray things in black and white. Is easier for the party to remain in power, because the Chinese need to show the Indians as somehow being subservient or an appendage to the United States, because else the Communist Party will confront questions from the Chinese people saying, look, if you can't handle the Indians, if you can't, if you take losses in a conflict with the Indians, how is it that you're ready for a conflict with the Americans? How is it that you're going to be ready for taking over Taiwan, for example? So I think the Chinese will be forced to pay attention to India. Now, the problem on the Indian side, the challenge on the Indian side is this lack of staying power. I just mentioned the kind of pressures that there might be on the Indian side, domestic pressures. I mean, okay, you want to return to the strong economic relationship with China, because if you burn all your bridges with the Chinese, it's not as if the Western countries are going to give you products at a discount. It just reduces our leverage, our bargaining power, economically speaking, with Western countries. But there's also domestic imperative. Pakistan is the issue that sells domestically, electorally in India, and China is too far seen as too complicated or too complex a relation, an issue for ordinary Indians to deal with, for politicians to be concerned with. So, there would be a tendency to push this equation or relationship to the back burner, and it shows, because we have very little information actually coming out of the government. No white papers, no parliamentary standing committee reports on what went wrong at Galwan. I mean, who's responsible? Why was it that we were caught napping? And how that led to Galwan, and so on. So, unless the government has a sense of accountability, or unless the citizens and parliament can hold government accountable, our challenges in formulating uh, careful, smart China policy is also going to continue. There's very little investment in China studies in India, very little investment in research on China, very little investment in developing Chinese language skills, in support for Chinese language skills or Chinese research in academia, within institutions of government. I mean, things are changing, things have picked up pace, but very little synergy between, say, the civilian sector and the government and the military and so on. So, as long as these issues continue, there's a problem. And let me end with another thing, which is, well, there is still a great deal of attention to China today, at least because of Galwan. I mean, a lot of the younger generation now see Galwan as the equivalent of a 1962 sort of moment in coming to understand and paying attention to China. So, in that sense, it's a good thing. But my fear is that while everybody is now beginning to pay attention to China, if India really wants to be a leading power, as the foreign minister keeps putting it, if India wants to really be a global power, India also needs to be paying attention to other parts of the world, and that's something that the Chinese, show you in great measure. That they are not only focused on the United States or the West or on India, but they are focused on all of South Asia. They have expertise and language competencies across the globe, and in India, Pakistan, and China suck all the oxygen out of the room as far as international relations or area studies is concerned. And we do not have enough expertise or attention, even on our own neighborhood or extended neighborhood like Southeast Asia or Central Asia or West Asia. And that's a lacuna that we also need to fill, to meet, or to bridge if we are to deal with China, if we are to set smart China policy.
Thank you, Jabin. Having a rivalry does not mean we are ready for it. And as you rightly underlined, that there's so much needs to be done. And I know that you are involved in many of these things, including training of the Indian military in the Chinese language. So I think some of those concerns should be taken up, and on a mission mode in a sense. There's a lot to catch up on the Indian side. Thank you so much, for giving us your valuable time. I have learned so much as always, but I'm also sure that anyone who will be listening, and we have listeners all over the world, would do as much. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To get updates on our work, visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also follow us on social media. We are on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thank you so much.